Agorism is a libertarian social philosophy that advocates creating a society in which all relations between people are voluntary exchanges by means of counter-economics, thus engaging with aspects of peaceful revolution. It was first proposed by libertarian philosopher Samuel Edward Konkin III.
In its three-count complaint, the government says a man known as the Dread Pirate Roberts was able to rake in $80 million in 2 years through an illegal site he created, a secretive online marketplace for drugs, one so perfect that it could make the street corner dealer obsolete.
I bought, I think, 10 hits of LSD for me and a few friends, and we biked through Golden Gate Park and basically had a really amazing day the week after.
The government says hundreds of thousands of users like this man use the impossible-to-trace website which sells drugs, weapons, forged documents, and even hitmen. It's called the Silk Road.
Here we are looking at a listing for heroin China White, 1 gram.
Nicholas Christian is a professor at Carnegie Mellon who has spent months researching Silk Road.
Most people want to get the drugs, but they don't want the social interactions that come with those purchases. And Silk Road takes that out of the equation.
Silk Road was a huge enterprise. Nearly 1 million users bought and sold $1.2 billion worth of illegal goods on the site using the virtual currency called Bitcoins, making it, according to the FBI, the most sophisticated and extensive criminal marketplace on the internet today. And the government says it was the brainchild of this man, 29-year-old Ross William Ulbricht, a.k.a. Dread Pirate Roberts, who, according to authorities, not only ran the site, but actually tried to hire a hitman, paying someone $150,000 to execute a user who was blackmailing him. Federal agents never found a victim.
But police allege that nice bloke soon turned nasty. They claim that as his online drugstore grew into $1 billion empire, Ulbricht began to feel threatened. And it was then, the FBI alleges, that Ross Ulbricht's thoughts began to turn to murder.
It would appear, though, that he did order a hit, and it would appear as though he thought the hit had been carried out.
Yes, he paid for it.
The FBI alleges Ross Ulbricht was now living the life of a deadly drug lord and paid more than $700,000 to have 6 of his perceived enemies killed, although no bodies have ever been found.
One of those hits, the hitman talked about the reported victim had 3 other roommates, and they went back and forth on should we kill them outside of the home or in the home, and he just said, I'll leave it up to your discretion, but it'd probably be easier just to do it in the home.
In fact, you have access to less than 10% of it. The other 90% of the internet is hidden, a vast secret cyber underworld. It's called the dark web, and people aren't using it to buy shoes. They're buying drugs, weapons, anything you can imagine. The subterranean realm is sinister and untraceable, with consequences that can be deadly. So, show me how you'd go about buying your drugs.
Okay, so to start with, let's see, maybe we'll go for stimulants.
I'm about to take you into a world I didn't know existed.
Okay, so we have quite a selection.
What you're seeing is the new way to buy drugs. And for 22-year-old Sarah, buying her drugs of choice, ecstasy and LSD, has never been easier.
Yeah, so this is the stuff that the kids are buying.
Okay.
To buy her drugs, Sarah doesn't even have to leave the house, because they're all here on websites like this one, called Silk Road.
Pure, uncut Peruvian cocaine. How much would you trust that?
I don't really trust anything that anyone says. I would read through all the forums and read through the feedback.
Incredibly, drug dealers are rated for their honesty and the quality of their products. A biofeedback system just like eBay. Online drug markets have flourished because customers can pay their dealer without a credit card and without leaving a money trail. And that's made possible by what is a new legal currency called Bitcoin, now in use all over the world, including Australia.
If you subscribe to the official narrative of the government and the mainstream media, they'll have you believe that Ross Ulbricht was a drug kingpin, someone in the mold of Tony Montana, or in real life, Al Capone. Someone who trafficked over $80 million worth of drugs, who sold drugs to young children, children that died of drug overdoses long before they were ever supposed to leave this earth. They'll tell you that Ross Ulbricht hired hitmen to take out opponents in a drug war, killing up to 6 people. If you listen to Ross Ulbricht's defense, they'll tell you that Ross admits to setting up the Silk Road website, and that he did post under the pseudonym Dread Pirate Roberts. Dread Pirate Roberts was a fictitious character in the movie Princess Bride. He stood for anti-government and libertarian ideals. But he'll also tell you that Dread Pirate Roberts was used by multiple people. Ross Ulbricht grew up in Austin, Texas, where he would serve as a Boy Scout and attain rank as an Eagle Scout. In 2002, he would graduate from high school and go on to attend college at Texas University. Ross would graduate from Texas University in 2006 with a bachelor's degree in physics. He then attended Penn State University, where he would get a master's degree in material science and engineering. By the time Ulbricht graduated, he had become more interested in libertarian economic theory. In particular, Ulbricht adhered to the political philosophy of Ludwig von Mises and supported Ron Paul. Ludwig von Mises was an Austrian-American theoretical Austrian school economist. Mises wrote and lectured extensively on behalf of classical liberalism. He is best known for his work on praxeology, a study of human choice and action. Mises immigrated from Austria to the United States in 1940. Since the mid-20th century, the libertarian movement in the United States has been strongly influenced by Mises' writings. Before we look more into the court case involving Ross Ulbricht and the Silk Road, let's gain a deeper understanding of what people call the deep web.
So let's start with the basics. What is this hidden internet exactly? Now, the media coverage of the deep web usually describes it as a vast hidden area, 5,000 times larger than the surface web and filled with criminals. But that is actually false. The deep web is not a place, is not hidden, and actually harbors zero criminal activity. It simply accounts for the unindexed content online, the raw data that Google doesn't know about and doesn't care about. For example, your online banking data is not stored anywhere on Google, and your company may have an internal network that you use to communicate. This exists in the deep web. But there is a hidden internet. A tiny little area called the darknet, or dark web. And this small corner of the internet is comprised primarily of information that is actively hidden from public view. And this is the area worth talking about. So, the darknet, it can only be accessed by specific tools, like Tor, which is a special browser and service that masks your browsing activity and gets you into the darknet. Will you find crime? Yes, but not to the degree that the media has claimed, and crime is neither the primary use of the darknet nor why it was built. Now, the internet was originally funded by the Department of Defense, and as it became publicly facing with the World Wide Web, new technologies were created to ensure its use for defense. So really, the darknet is just another tool, and it's used by government agencies all over the world, along with journalists, dissidents in countries with hostile governments, whistleblowers, and just regular folks who want to create and utilize anonymous online communities like the ones I spent so much time in back in the late 80s. And like any place where human beings congregate, there is illegal activity. So let's look at that. There are black market selling drugs, and many of these, most of these, like the Silk Road, primarily sell marijuana. Altogether, they represent a small fraction of the physical drug trade. Guns? Yes, guns have been sold on the darknet, though not effectively. Sadly, why would you want to hassle with the darknet when you can buy a semi-automatic rifle anywhere, from Walmart to Instagram? There is child pornography on the darknet, though significantly less than is available on the surface web. And contrary to popular mythology, there is no tangible evidence that actual legitimate hitmen services have ever been offered on the darknet, or that significant terrorist activity has either. So, why the cyberspin and hysteria in the media? Well, it sells. It's good for clickbait. It makes for, sexy TV shows and movies. It sells magazines. But there is another agenda at work: to demonize the darknet and to scare people away from it. Now, who would want to do that? People in power who believe that the privacy and anonymity that the darknet enables will cause them to lose control.
Control being the name of the game. Not only did the Silk Road create a marketplace that the government could not track, trace, or tax, it also accepted bitcoins for its drug sales, elevating a currency that had the potential to threaten the entire financial system of the establishment. Let's take a look at the charges brought up against Ulbricht. From FBI.Gov, May 29, 2015. Ross Ulbricht, aka Dread Pirate Roberts, sentenced in Manhattan Federal Court to life in prison. Ulbricht, 31, of San Francisco, California, was charged, convicted of 7 offenses after a 4-week jury trial: distributing narcotics by means of the internet, conspiring to distribute narcotics, engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, conspiring to commit computer hacking, conspiring to traffic in false identity documents, and conspiring to commit money laundering. In summary, looking past the redundancy of the charges, Ross Ulbricht was charged with trafficking narcotics, engaging in a criminal enterprise, computer hacking, trafficking in false identifications, and money laundering. The government appears to have got their man. And after a 4-week jury trial, Ross Ulbricht, at the age of 31 years old, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The first thing that jumped out at me was why, if the government had digital proof that Ross Ulbricht had attempted to hire someone to murder 6 people, did they leave that charge out? And as we've learned from the past, to every murder, to every suicide, to every court case, there are 2 sides to the story. Let's take a look at the side that goes against the official government narrative.
This has basically been called Chuck Schumer's case. He called for the closing of the site in June of 11. Although, interestingly, when they seized the server and could have closed it and supposedly stopped it from, as he said, doing more damage, they kept it open for business for 4 more months. But in any case, Ross was arrested in California, but he was tried in Schumer State. The lead prosecutor over the whole thing is Preet Bharara. He was Schumer's special counsel for a couple of decades. And the presiding judge, Katherine Forrest, was recommended by Schumer for her position. So there was a lot of Schumer in this case. And he did. He, before trial, before any evidence, came out publicly in a letter to Eric Holder, to the Justice Department, and said, "Congratulations, DOJ, you got your man." And I was shocked. I was like, wait, innocent till proven guilty. Hello. A U.S. senator is just completely trampling on that very basic tenet of our justice system, presumption of innocence. This was a presumption of guilt that was publicly made by a United States senator in the state where Ross was to be tried. I mean, how can you have a fair trial?
This from the New York Times on August 8th, 2009, regarding Preet Bharara, one of the lead prosecutors on the case. Schumer aide is confirmed as United States Attorney. Mr. Bharara was recommended by Mr. Schumer for the powerful post. This from NYU Law regarding Katherine Forrest, the judge on the Silk Road case. Katherine Forrest, 90, and former Alexander Fellow Allison Nathan confirmed to the federal bench. In recommending Forrest's nomination, Senator Charles Schumer of New York said, "Katherine Forrest has excelled at the top of her profession, both at Kavath and at the Department of Justice, and we need her skills on the bench today. This from Schumer Senate.gov, Charles E. Schumer, United States Senator for New York, about Chuck. After New Yorkers re-elected him in 2004, Chuck secured two powerful posts, a seat on the Senate Finance Committee, which oversees the nation's tax, trade, Social Security, and healthcare legislation. Ross's defense claims that he has been a political fall guy, set up and made an example of. And clearly there are connections between Chuck Schumer, the Senate Finance Committee, Preet, Bharara, and Judge Katherine Forrest. But even with all those connections, any suggestion of a setup seems very far-fetched. That was until I came across this next piece of information.
So there were two FBI agents that had administrative access for 2 years to the Silk Road. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, just to be precise,
Yes.
I believe they had, they were working undercover in Silk Road for 2 years. I believe they gained the access when Curtis Green was arrested in January of 13. So I don't know that they had the keys to the kingdom for 2 years, but they had it for almost a year. They had plenty of time. They were very, very well versed in computer technology. One was an expert in it, and the other was good at it. And they used their access to steal almost $1 million. But they also did have high-level administrative access to the site. They could change passwords, reset PIN numbers. They could commandeer accounts. They had the ability to take over DPR's account and other accounts. They could write messages, private messages. They could post things on the marketplace and on the forum. You know, they could change or create private messages with access to bank accounts, I mean, keys, on and on and on. Basically, they could do pretty much anything. And these are two corrupt agents, and I can say that now without using alleged because they've pled guilty, which it reinforces the fact that, yes, the corruption was occurring. And how can anyone say that doesn't taint the evidence? How can we rely on this evidence?
The two agents that Lynn Ulbricht were referring to were Drug Enforcement Administration agent Carl Mark Forrest IV and Secret Service agent Shawn Bridges. It came out during the trial that the IRS was charging these two agents with fraud, bribery, and money laundering, among other charges. At the time, the defense requested to the judge that the jury be made aware that two prominent members of the Silk Road investigation team were being charged with fraud. The judge ruled that the jury would not be allowed to know about this predicament. The defense then requested that the Silk Road trial be put on hold until the trials of Mark Forrest and Shawn Bridges had been settled and it can be determined if fraud was relevant and that the jury should be allowed to know about it. The judge ruled that the trial would go on and that the jury would not be allowed to know about the corrupt agents. Let's take a look at the charges brought against Carl Mark Forrest of the DEA and Shawn Bridges of the Secret Service, two prominent members of the Silk Road investigating team. The following is from the United States of America versus Carl Mark Forrest. Summary. The government had multiple investigations into the Silk Road marketplace, an underground black market that allowed vendors and buyers to conduct illegal transactions over the internet. One of these investigations was conducted in the Southern District of New York, and the other was conducted out of the Baltimore District of Maryland. Both Forrest and Bridges were assigned to the Baltimore investigation and not the New York investigation. The two investigations were conducted independently of each other. Throughout 2012 and 2013, both Forrest and Bridges had significant responsibilities related to Baltimore's investigation. In this capacity, Forrest was the lead undercover agent in communication with DPR, the owner, administrator, and operator of the Silk Road website. Bridges was the computer forensics expert on the Baltimore investigation. In their capacity as members of the Baltimore Silk Road Task Force, both Forrest and Bridges had significant exposure to and developed expertise in the digital currency known as Bitcoin. As will be described further herein, Forrest and Bridges abused their positions as federal agents and engaged in a scheme to defraud a variety of third parties, the public, and the government, all for their own financial enrichment. With respect to the former Drug Enforcement Administration, Special Agent Forrest, the investigation has revealed, among other things, Forrest created certain fictitious personas that were not officially sanctioned to communicate with DPR, the target of Forrest's investigation. Using one of these personas, Forrest sought to extort DPR by seeking monetary payment, offering in exchange not to provide the government with certain information if DPR paid $250,000. Forrest acted outside the scope of his official role on the Baltimore Silk Road Task Force and created a fictitious persona named as French Maid. Operating as French Maid, Forrest fraudulently represented to DPR certain information concerning French Maid's true identity and offered to sell DPR information about the government's investigation into Silk Road in exchange for approximately $100,000 worth of Bitcoin, which DPR paid and Forrest deposited into his own personal accounts. Forrest stole and converted to his own personal use a sizable amount of Bitcoins that DPR sent to Forrest in Forrest's official undercover capacity, that rather than returning those Bitcoins over to the government, Forrest deposited them into his own personal accounts. Forrest engaged in a series of complex transactions between various Bitcoin accounts, his personal digital currency accounts, and his personal bank accounts, including a $235,000 wire to an overseas account in Panama, all in an effort to launder and conceal true source of the illegal gotten proceeds. Forrest used his official position as the DEA agent to illegally run criminal history checks on individuals for benefits of a third-party digital currency exchange company, CoinMKT, in which Forrest had personally invested approximately $110,000 worth of Bitcoin. Forrest functioned as the de facto chief compliance officer for CoinMKT, all the while employed as a DEA agent, even allowing himself to be featured in CoinMKT's pitch decks to venture capital investors and allowing himself to be listed as CoinMKT's anti-money laundering and/or compliance officer in order to benefit CoinMKT, a company which Forrest had invested. Forrest improperly directed CoinMKT to freeze one of its individual customers' accounts containing a large amount of digital currency worth approximately $297,000, even though he lacked a sufficient legal basis on which to do so, and Forrest then illegally seized those funds and transferred them into his own personal account. And Forrest used his supervisor's signature stamp without authorization on an official U.S. Department of Justice subpoena and sent the subpoena to a payment company, Venmo, directing the company to unfreeze his own personal account, which had been previously frozen due to certain suspicious activity. Forrest then sought to conceal evidence of his improper use of an official subpoena by directing the company not to contact the DEA and attempting to destroy copies of the subpoena. When the company did not comply, Forrest asked that another agent on the Baltimore Silk Road Task Force, an IRS agent, to collaborate with him on seizing the company's bank accounts. With respect to the former U.S. Secret Service agent Bridges, the investigation has revealed, among other things, that in late 2013, members of the Baltimore Silk Road Task Force, to include Bridges and Forrest, gained access to a Silk Road website administrator account as a result of the arrest of a former Silk Road employee. On January 25, 2013, the Silk Road website suffered a sizable theft of bitcoins which were moved into MT-GOX, a digital currency exchange based in Japan. On February 12, 2013, Bridges formed and registered a personal limited liability company called Quantum International Investments, LLC, and on February 22, 2013, Bridges opened an account at Fidelity Investments in the name of Quantum. According to the records obtained from Fidelity, Bridges funded his Quantum Fidelity account exclusively with wire deposits from MT Gox in Japan, specifically between March 6, 2013 through May 7, 2013. Bridges' Quantum Fidelity account in the United States received 9 wire transfers from MT Gox, totaling approximately $820,000. Despite having personally benefited in this amount of $820,000 from a MT Gox account and receiving a large wire on May 7, 2013 from MT Gox, just 2 days later on May 9, 2013, Bridges served as the affiant on a multi-million-dollar seizure warrant for MT Gox and its owners' bank accounts, and upon learning of the government's criminal investigation into the Baltimore Silk Road Task Force, based in the Northern District of California, and a following interview by the FBI as part of the criminal investigation, Bridges transferred over $250,000 out of his Quantum Fidelity account via wire transfers into another bank account held by himself and a third party. Because this affidavit is for the limited purpose of establishing probable cause for the crimes proposed to be charged at the present time, it does not include certain additional facts known to me, and the government's investigation continues. Since the time of the Silk Road trial, both Forrest and Bridges have pled guilty to the charges against them and are both currently imprisoned. Forrest was the lead undercover agent in communication with DPR, the lead agent, and Bridges was the lead computer forensics expert that Baltimore relied on as part of their investigation. The jury was never allowed to know about these corrupt agents. Looking into the charges against those agents, it also jumped out to me that they funneled or laundered their money through something called MT Gox out of Japan. When reading about the trial, I had come across MT Gox earlier, but I didn't know if it was relevant at the time. Let's take a look. This from ARS Technica, Law and Disorder, Defense Bombshell in Silk Road Trial. MT Gox owner set up Ulbricht. Mark Karpeles had intimate involvement with the site, Ross Ulbricht's lawyer claims. January 15, 2015. New York. After the lunch break Thursday in the Silk Road trial, defendant Ross Ulbricht took off his jacket. Minutes later, his lawyer, Joshua Dreidel, took off the gloves. In just over an hour of statico cross-examination, Dreidel's strategy became clear. He was going to pursue a line of questioning, suggesting that the man who really controlled Silk Road wasn't his young client, but Mark Karpeles, the wealthy former owner of the MT Gox Bitcoin exchange. If Karpeles could use Silk Road, a freewheeling drug market, to jack up the price of Bitcoin, he could become incredibly rich. It was a currency he had more invested in than anyone else. Until it was shut down, the great majority of Bitcoin trades went through his MT Gox currency exchange. You thought you had probable cause that Mark Karpeles was intimately involved as the head of the Silk Road, correct? Dreidel asked Homeland Security Agent Jared Der Yeglian, don't quote me on the pronunciation, who has been on the stand since Tuesday. By the contents of this affidavit, yes, he answered. In 2013, he had filled out papers asking a judge for a warrant to further investigate Karpeles. The questioning took the government and the U.S. District Judge Katherine Forrest by surprise. Prosecutor Saren Turner objected, saying Dreidel was trying to get hearsay evidence. Soon, the jury was out of the room. Dreidel then stated his thesis more clearly. They had this guy, Karpeles, in their sights, and he had never been charged, Dreidel said. Our position is that he set up Mr. Ulbricht. The full story didn't unfold today. Der was briefly back on the stand, but the government peppered the cross-examination with questions, It was over by 4 p.m., and the jury was dismissed for a long weekend.
I just one other question. You mentioned, and we talked at length about this yesterday, about the controlled narrative of the trial. And I was shocked to find out, given the charges, that you were denied certain expert witnesses.
Yeah.
And that certain things that were relevant, say on a Friday, suddenly over the weekend come Monday, the judge is telling you, no, this is irrelevant and we're going to move on. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that aspect of the trial?
Yeah, well, a lot of that came from the example I gave yesterday was the third day of trial. DHS agent Jared Yegan was cross-examined by Ross's attorney, Joshua Draytell. And did you want me to go into the whole thing? Sure. Okay, sure. And what came out of that, just sort of briefly, is that Yegan had been undercover for 2 years, thousands of hours on the site. And he actually said he believed there were more than one DPR. But he was honing in on one of them, Mark Karpeles. That is what he said in trial. I'm not accusing Mark of anything. I just want to be clear about that. You know, it's what was in trial. And he said in 2 signed affidavits, sworn affidavits, that he had probable cause to suspect him, to think he was DPR, and to get a warrant for his Gmail account. And asked other agencies, don't tip him off. I'm honing in on this guy. And in DHS Baltimore, Maryland, the site of the extensive corruption, those agents came out of that same place, did tip Karpeles off and seized over $1 million from his account. The next thing we hear, the Karpeles' lawyers approached DHS Baltimore and said, hey, we've got a deal for you. You back off our client Karpeles and we'll give you a name. We'll give you DPR. Mm-hmm. And the next thing we hear from the witness was that 2 weeks later, Ross was arrested and Karpeles has never been charged. At that point, the prosecution leaped up, objection, this line of questioning is going to stop. They're trying to say somebody else's DPR. This isn't going to happen. And the judge was like, well, yeah, that's what you do. That is valid. And he kept arguing, and she decided to cut off the cross-examination. Josh had about another hour at least to go. Send the jury home early and discuss this. And she said, you know, if he had probable cause to believe Mark Karpeles was DPR, it's relevant. And she went on to list other things that were highly relevant, obviously relevant. And she said, look, the cat's out of the bag. Karpeles is possible DPR. And that was on Thursday. By the next Tuesday, the court ruled, no, actually, forget what we said then. It's not relevant. None of it's relevant. And in fact, the jury needs to forget they heard any of it. And the prosecution gets a mulligan. I'm going to tag what should have been objected to, and so we can retroactively sustain it. And by the way, we're going to put you on a very tight leash as far as what you can ask.
When the jury returned after the weekend, they were ordered to forget anything they heard regarding MT Gox and Mark Karpeles, that the government was investigating Mark Karpeles as being Dread Pirate Roberts. Even if they had been allowed to remember that information, to use it as part of their decision-making process, they still would not have had the context that 2 agents, lead agents on the case, committed fraud and embezzlement and laundering, and that they funneled their money through MT Gox. This would just be the beginning. Multiple experts regarding Bitcoin and web design were also not allowed, not permitted to testify in front of the jury.
We tried to bring the defense did a computer expert, because there were a lot of questions about the integrity and competence of the laptop investigation. Multi-agencies had it, it crashed in the middle, there was all kinds of questions about they didn't follow guidelines, you know. And this expert could have explained that. He could have explained the how hidden websites, the technology behind it, makes it very difficult to prove anything. He wasn't allowed to testify because one of the reasons, this case doesn't require special technical knowledge. And from then on, as our lawyer put, his defense was eviscerated. He wasn't allowed to cross-examine effectively. And Forbes wrote about it and said it was completely derailed. And then following that, as you said, witnesses were not allowed to testify. It was a Bitcoin witness, Andreas Antonopoulos, was not allowed to testify to challenge the Bitcoin testimony of the government, which, by the way, paid $55,000 for that testimony. Boy, I'd like to have that kind of money for this case. And they have unlimited money, apparently. And Roger Ver said, he said, they either don't understand how it works, that Bitcoin works, or they're lying about it. And we weren't permitted to challenge that and explain that to the jury because one of the reasons, the jury understands Bitcoin just fine. That's irrelevant. That's unnecessary. And the jury is like, really? I mean, Bitcoin's complicated. They did not understand Bitcoin.
The defense was denied the right to hire their own experts to counter the testimony of the experts hired by the government. The government expert on Bitcoin was paid $55,000 for his testimony. A powerful, powerful leverage. This gets into another issue involved in this case, and for all of us, our property rights and our rights to defend ourselves and get a fair trial. The government currently practices civil asset forfeiture. Basically, they could freeze your assets if they proclaim that you gain them through illegal activities. Of course, that is the presumption of guilt before innocence in a country where we are supposed to presume innocence before guilt. Because the assets of Ross Ulbricht were frozen, confiscated, and eventually auctioned by the government, the money to defend himself against the government was very limited. This looks at a bigger issue, something we all need to think about, because one day it could be us sitting in a courtroom in front of the government. Another issue that would arise in the case was how the government was able to locate the Silk Road servers.
And one place that seemed like there's a big unanswered question is how did they find the server? And the explanation, the declaration under oath by Christopher Tarbell was just debunked worldwide. I mean, experts all over the world said it was impossible, gibberish, a lie, inconsistent with reality. I mean, he was just widely debunked. And he goes, well, sorry, I didn't save my work, so I can't really respond. Like, okay, that's convenient.
I did a great deal of research into how the government located the Silk Road servers and how people attempted to debunk the government's argument. What I can tell you is it's very technical. So instead of trying to explain it myself, I will let Edward Snowden give you his take on the situation.
In the case of Ross Ulbricht, who was prosecuted for founding the Silk Road website and is now effectively, he's appealing it, but a life sentence, do you assume, or should we assume, that the NSA was involved in corroborating or gathering evidence which they might have denied in the actual trial?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. All right. That was easy enough. Two questions.
Just to elaborate on that, I apologize, because I don't mean to be pat there.
Yeah.
But the NSA in the United States is a member of a larger group called the Five Eyes Network, right? This is the United States, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And these five countries, they sort of mix everything together in a common pot, and they share and share alike. They're not allowed to ask a partner to violate their laws, but partners can share information that would have been in violation of their laws if they didn't ask for it. Now, not to say that particular strategy applied in this context, But the difference between the National Security Agency's authorities, and particularly the British equivalent of the NSA called the GCHQ, their authorities, is the UK is allowed to use NSA systems, right, that we built that work in the United States and everything else, against or under the mandate of what's called a serious crimes authority that's completely unrelated to national intelligence prerogatives. And this includes drug trafficking. They are literally mandated for this. They use our systems for this. And in the fruits of their investigations, they can share freely with us. So I would say yes, of course. And it was foolish in the court case. I understand why they did it. He didn't want to own the server at the time. He didn't want to say, yes, this is mine. Therefore, the judge wouldn't allow him to make sort of a Fourth Amendment argument here that investigatory restrictions have been violated. But it seems unthinkable to me that there was not an intelligence angle internationally that was involved in that case.
As you can see, there is so much more to this case than one man's freedom. Edward Snowden brought up the Fourth Amendment, the right to privacy, how our government coordinates with other governments internationally, that other governments could collect spy information on us and give it to our government, America, and America could collect information on the citizens of other governments and pass off that information. The government is going around our laws to spy on the American citizens. We have a right to privacy. An additional debate that was brought up as part of this case is search warrants. The government obtained a search warrant for the laptop of Ross Ulbricht, but they didn't look for anything specific. And if the government was going to search your file cabinet and they got a warrant for that, they would have to be looking for a specific piece of information specified in the warrant. But according to the government, they don't need to do the same thing for a laptop. They could search anything attached to it. So if they get a warrant for your laptop, they don't have to look for anything specific. They could dig through it, and who knows what they'll find about you and anything your laptop is connected to. There was one more issue in this case that I just kept going back to. The government claimed to have, and I will attach the transcripts of what the government claims is a conversation between DPR, Dread Pirate Roberts, who they say was Ross Ulbricht, and what Ross believed to be a hitman, to have 6 people murdered. And if you read the transcript, it is pretty damning. So why did the government not charge Ross with murder for hire, even though no bodies were ever found and there's no individual people who are specified to be targeted in the murders for hire? Well, I did a little digging, and I found out that the government's murder for hire charge, or accusation, I should say, was another house of cards. November 21st, 2014, to be filed under seal. The United States versus Ross William Ulbricht. Dear Judge Forrest, the government writes respectfully concerning an ongoing federal grand jury investigation being conducted by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of California in conjunction with the Public Integrity Section of the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice. The subject of the grand jury investigation is former special agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration named Carl Force. In 2012 and 2013, S.A. Force was involved as an undercover agent in an investigation of Silk Road conducted by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Maryland. As the court is aware, USAO Baltimore has a pending indictment against Ross Ulbricht. Charges Ulbricht with, among other things, soliciting the murder for hire of a Silk Road employee. S.A. Force is the undercover agent whom Ulbricht allegedly hired to arrange the murder for hire, as described in the indictment. It is likely that the government stayed away from murder for hire charges because they were aware that if they went forward with those charges, it would have came out to the jury that Carl M. Force, the agent who allegedly had conversations with Ross Ulbricht regarding hire for murder, was under investigation for corruption in the Silk Road case, something he would later plead guilty and go to jail for. That if the jury became aware of the corrupt agents on the case, that the entire case would fall apart. Yet, this didn't stop the court, the government, and the media for using murder-for-hire allegations to turn the public against Ross Ulbricht, condemn the Silk Road, and to further bolster their court case and their sentencing against Ross Ulbricht.
Good question. They use a lot of trial tactics that make me wonder, why do you have to do this if your case is so strong? One of them also was to bring up uncharged crimes, things he was not charged with or convicted for, specifically that murder-for-hire charge that was so damaging to his reputation, to his image, but that they never charged him for, or obviously, or convicted him for. They used it to deprive him of bail by saying he was dangerous and relying on that. They used it to deprive the defense of the witness list until a couple of days before trial, which is usually you get it weeks before, to allow you to prepare a powerful cross-examination. They didn't have that chance. They used it in trial, of course. Mm-hmm. You know, they said to the jury, oh, by the way, we're not charging you for this or anything, but, and they went on for a day talking about it, which of course is going to prejudice the jury. Of course it's going to poison the atmosphere, and they're going to believe that details, he wasn't charged with it, but they're talking about it, it must be true. And finally, they relied very heavily on it at sentencing. The judge did, to justify this outrageous sentence, even though he was not charged or convicted for it. Now, I thought a sentencing was about addressing your convictions that a jury voted on in a trial.
The following is an excerpt from the sentencing hearing. There would be a 2-level upward offense level adjustment for the directed use of violence. Because it is contested, the court must make appropriate factual findings if it is to include it. The standard by which I do that is by a preponderance of the evidence. Ulbricht's directed violence here is and relates to the murders for hire, which he is alleged to have commissioned and paid for. The court must determine whether these allegations have been demonstrated by a preponderance of the evidence, and I find that there is ample and unambiguous evidence that Ulbricht commissioned 5 murders as part of his efforts to protect his criminal enterprise, and that he paid for these murders. There is no evidence that he was role-playing. The court finds that the evidence is clear and unambiguous, and it far exceeds the necessary preponderance findings. That Ulbricht believed he was paying for murders of those he wanted eliminated, and that he believed they had in fact been murdered. He was told his first victim had a wife and several children. That fact was known to Ulbricht, and it is never mentioned by him in connection with his consideration of the murder. The consequences flowing from the murder of a man with his family is never, so far as the court can tell from the record, considered. Throughout the case, Ross Ulbricht was denied bail due to allegations of murder for hire. His defense was denied early access to witnesses due to allegations of murder for hire. The jury was told about allegations of murder for hire. They were read the transcripts that allegedly took place between Carl M. Force, corrupt DEA agent, and Ross Ulbricht. They were not told that Carl M. Force was himself under investigation for fraud, something he would later go to jail for. At the sentencing hearing, the judge would reference the murders for hire that a jury did not decide on as part of the reason for the lengthy and draconian sentencing. And this was only the beginning of the troubling statements made by the judge during the sentencing hearing. This is a case in which general deterrence plays a particularly important role. This is one of those cases. It is a case without serious precedent. What you did was unprecedented, and in breaking that ground as the first person, You sit here as a defendant now today having to pay the consequences for that. There is a significant public interest in this case in terms of the social utility analysis or any kind of risk-reward analysis. For those considering stepping into your shoes, carrying some flag, some misguided flag, or doing something similar, they need to understand very clearly and without equivocation that if you break the law this way, there will be very, very serious consequences. You don't bear only general deterrence, you also bear the responsibility for the other factors as well. That is just one element of this analysis. As we discussed earlier, the government deterring people from visiting the deep web and the dark net has little to do with drugs and underground crime, and everything to do with control. Control over the monitoring of people, control over finances, control over taxation, and control over the monetary system. And in the sentencing, the judge basically admitted that the government set out to make an example of Ross Ulbricht, that they needed to make an example of him. And as we demonstrated throughout this entire video, the government would do anything, including deny Ross a fair trial, in order to make that example. And still, the most disturbing part of the sentencing has yet to come. It is also notable that the reasons you started Silk Road were philosophical, and I don't know that it is a philosophy left behind. And except for your family and friends and the statements you made today, I don't know that you feel a lot of remorse for the people who were hurt. I don't know that you believe you hurt a lot of people. I don't think you know that you hurt many. Agorism, a political philosophy born out of libertarian ideals of live and let live and do no harm. That two parties, could make voluntary economic exchanges without the government being involved. That they could trade goods and they could have a financial system outside of taxation, outside of government control and government eyes. This was the biggest threat to the government. The political philosophy of Ross Ulbricht and the Silk Road. The idea that people could operate freely without the control of a centralized system. Nothing is a greater threat to the ruling class. I don't know if Ross Ulbricht was involved in murder for hire. If he was, I'm glad he's in jail because that's terrible. But the government did not prove that. They did not even charge that. And the agent that alleged it himself was corrupt. And the government had every reason to use allegations of murder for hire to pin Silk Road and make Ross Ulbricht appear to be a drug kingpin. Speaking of drugs, this case gets into the idea of transferred liability, because throughout the government's case, they didn't say that Ross Ulbricht ever sold any drugs. He simply set up a website which allowed people to make free transactions between each other, and he took a percentage of every transaction. Other people, third parties, sold drugs using his platform. Other products were also sold. It's worth noting that Ross Ulbricht, if he was Dread Pirate Pirates, but the Silk Road didn't allow child pornography to be sold on their site. And they didn't allow stolen items to be sold on their site. This case also gets into Fourth Amendment issues. What the government needs a warrant for, what our rights to privacy are, how the NSA collaborates with other governments to spy on American citizens and spies on citizens all over the world. This case sets precedents, and it is of the utmost importance, which is why the government clearly went out of their way to deny Ross Ulbricht a fair trial, because they needed a conviction to set an example, to let anyone know that if you are going to go forth with the political philosophy, the idea that you could operate freely outside of the control of the oligarchs, of the government, you will be hit, and you will be hit hard. An example to not dare attempt to operate outside of a system of control. A system of control which also encapsulates monetary control. A website which potentially, and clearly did at this point, through drug sales, lifted a currency known as Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies, which operate outside of the monetary control system, the Federal Reserve System. This case has so much significance. It is beyond one person's freedom, one person who didn't even get a fair trial. We have to take a step back and explore what is the appropriate level of government, because government has gotten out of control. And they will push back hard against a political philosophy of libertarianism, a philosophy of live and let live, do no harm, and a philosophy that states we don't need the government to dictate everything that happens in our lives. I will close with this. In 2016, I believe in October, Julian Assange chimed in on being a political prisoner and political prisoners in the West.
Leaving open their ability to extradite. I just find it absolutely amazing that the narrative about this situation is not put out publicly in the press. Because it doesn't suit the Western establishment narrative that, yes, the West has political prisoners. It's a reality. It's not just me. There's a bunch of other people as well. Yeah. The West has political prisoners. No state accepts to call the people it is imprisoning or detaining for political reasons political prisoners. They don't call them political prisoners in China. They don't call them political prisoners in Azerbaijan. And they don't call them political prisoners in the United States, UK, or Sweden. It's absolutely intolerable to have that kind of self-perception. But here we have a case, talking about the Swedish case, where I have never been charged with a crime, where I have already been cleared and found to be innocent, where the woman herself said that the police made it up, where the United Nations formally said the whole thing is illegal, where the state of Ecuador also investigated and found that I should be given asylum. Those are the facts. But what is the rhetoric?
Different.
The rhetoric is constantly pretending that I have been charged with a crime, never mentioning that I have been already previously cleared, never mentioning that the woman herself says that the police made it up, trying to avoid that the UN formally found that the whole thing is illegal, never even mentioning that Ecuador made a formal assessment through its formal processes and found that, yes, I am subject to persecution by the United States.
Ross Ulbricht's case is currently under appeal, and the family needs money to fight the government. If you want to donate, go to www.freeross.org, donate. I myself am also trying to build a news organization, and I need funding. So, if you go to www.patreon.com, any amount of money donated to me for the rest of the month of July, as in new donations, I will match in a donation to Ross Ulbricht's family at the end of the month. Help a good cause. Help grassroots media. Help Ross Ulbricht fight the government. Stand for liberty. I'm Tom Anderson, FFR News.